don't know. I am Elaine Mejia, the Vice President of Public Works. And again, thank you so much for joining us. I know there are lots and lots of demands on your time, and we hope this is a helpful conversation to you. I am joined by a few others from the Public Works team, Anika Fascia, Sarah White, and Marcia Kinsey. And as you can hopefully see on your screen, I'm also joined, we had some guest presenters and guests who are going to play a special role in today's conversation. So at least from my left to right, although I'm not sure that's the same on your screen, we've got Julie Rowe, the Senior Framing and Messaging Coordinator from the Opportunity Agenda. We've got Gavin DeVore-Leonard from One Ohio Now, Executive Director of One Ohio Now. We've got also Tazra Mitchell, Policy Analyst with the Budget and Tax Center Project with the North Carolina Justice Center. So thank you all for being willing to join in a special role in this conversation today. So before we really get started with the meat of the conversation, I want to turn to the slide where we give people some technical instructions. So let me see if I can do that. Did this slide advance for others? Nope, it's still stuck on this slide. Oh, okay, finally moved. Hopefully the fact that I just clicked it 3 or 4 times won't mean that it now is going to jump several slides. So you can just see that in the mode in which you're going to begin here, you can see that your own video feed from your end for the participants end is current, and your microphone are currently turned off. At some point when we get to some more conversational parts of the event, we can unmute you, and we will attempt to do that for those of you who raise a flag and chime in the comments section that you want to be heard and seen. We can unmute you. You should know that you will also need to unmute yourself at that moment in order to be heard and seen and be able to participate in the conversation in that way. People are also welcome at any time to pose a question or comment in the comments box that should be on your screen as well. So feel free to use that function. And you should know that, right, you need to click on the gear icon to adjust your audio and video settings, or to use the phone audio if you prefer to do that. And as I said, you can raise your flag if you want to ask a question. You can type your question in and we can read it, or or you can click on the chat conversation bubble and the chat function will appear. So thank you all for joining us. We've been practicing this with this new platform called Fuse. We've seen some other people use it, and we thought it was potentially a good fit for this new type of webinar, if you will, that we wanted to have, where it's really more of a conversation and less of us presenting slides and content and recommendations directly at you. So hopefully this format will work for that purpose. But in the interest of full disclosure, it is the first time that we've used it for this purpose. But like I said, we've been practicing with it sort of internally as our team. So hopefully it'll work well. And we've decided to take this new approach for some of our webinars this year for a number of different reasons. And I want to start out by just saying what a couple of those are. First of all, we are, as you know, we love to talk about and share the research that we've commissioned and the other great research, communications research that's going on around the country, and disseminate it and help you figure out how to use it on the ground in your day-to-day work. But we know that's extremely difficult. Similarly, many of you are reaching out to us regularly, and when we're with you in your states and communities and your coalitions, and you're presenting us with these scenarios and different challenges and sticky topics that emerge that you face. And it's not always particularly easy to just tell you there's some great simple slogan or message tested paragraph we can give you, because that's just not always the case. Some of these things we really feel like we need to hash out together. And at Public Works and organizations like the Opportunity Agenda, we're very happy to tell you what we think is out there as far as the research that can help guide the direction we all go on some of these sticky topics. But there's a lot to be done together to hash some of these things out. And we also know, because we currently have and have always had an approach at Public Works of really being out there in the field with you, helping you think through these things. We know that you have a tremendous amount of on-the-ground wisdom and experience that we want to harness to help us all address some of these sticky topics and help set up forums like this one in which you all can also connect with and share that kind of wisdom and interesting questions and ideas with one another, and not just with Public Works. So with that being said, hopefully this will be a good new format for us all to use to connect with one another and share our collective wisdom. Hopefully the slide will advance any second now, because I just pushed the next button, which is to say, I think it should be a slide that lays out, and it does, our agenda and our plan for the hour. So I've done a little bit of introductions and welcomes already. I'm going to set up the topic a little bit more. Then we are going to turn to some partners of ours from the field that we have worked with for a number of years. We've got Gavin, who we've already introduced, who's going to talk about how this particular topic has presented itself and how he's grappling with it in Ohio. Similarly with Tazra Mitchell in North Carolina. We're going to you can pose questions all along in the comments function, and we'll get to some of that. We'll get to those after Gavin and Tazra share some of their observations from how this is playing out in their states and things they're trying. Then we'll pause for some discussion where some of you can present how's this challenge emerging in your campaigns and in your communities and the work that you're doing, and offer your own observations and thoughts on it. And then we're going to really shift to hearing from Julie, and we really think the Opportunity Agenda has done some fantastic work and spearheaded some amazing research in the last few years that we really think is very relevant to this topic, and we want it to get not only Julie and her wisdom, but also the wisdom of their research to be accessible to all of you, because it's really an important addition to this field and to these conversations. So we'll spend some time with Julie, and then we'll sort of have a closing and wrap it up. And again, throw out questions in the comments function throughout. In the middle, when we really have a discussion, we will attempt to, for those of you who want to, pipe your video feed and your audio feed in as well. So that is our plan for the day. I will say that with respect to this particular topic, which we've chosen, which we've more or less described as sort of how do we grapple with this self-sufficiency rhetoric that's out there. And we have observed for quite a long time, working with so many of you, that it's very challenging, and we certainly understand sort of the desire to communicate about the sort of the work ethic and the desire of Americans to be able to improve their financial circumstances in life and to provide for themselves and for their families. Is such an important thing that we do need to get across, right, in our public communications. But at the same time, so many of the ways in which we might do that, we observe is potentially in contrast to what our research has found over the years, and in what we know are the best practices for promoting a more active role for government and public policy over time. So the challenge before us is so much of our rhetoric and the rhetoric we say out there kind of promotes government programs as having self-sufficiency or helping people achieve financial independence, as the end-all be-all goal. We really tend to divert to focusing more on the role that programs and services will have for individuals and less for sort of communities and bigger picture stories. And we often end up portraying government services as sort of being temporary, either for individuals who are in a particular circumstance in the moment, or collectively, but temporary, as in just for when the economy is in a downturn or in a bad place. And we depict it inadvertently also as sort of only being for those who are helping themselves, right? The unemployment insurance is really for those that are sort of out of work through no fault of their own, or the earned income tax credit. Oh, don't worry, it's only for people who work. And I know that's I'm using a lot of shorthand there, but you get the general idea. And the question is, does this kind of language is it inadvertently kind of creating not only categories of the deserving and undeserving, which is not helpful to us over time, as we want people to have a better understanding of the economy and how it works and the challenges that people really face, but it's also promoting a very limited and temporary idea for the role that government should play. So the question before us today, and that we work with so many of you on, and the purpose of this particular conversation, is to think about, well, are there better ways, right, to paint a picture of the reality of what people face and the desire of people to contribute and to move forward and advance economically, but in a way that promotes our long-term goals of promoting an active role for government in solving systemic, not individual, challenges like poverty and lack of opportunity. So we know from our own research that fostering a sense of interdependence, or at the very least elevating sort of community level thinking to be on par with individualism and independence, is really needed to encourage sort of civic participation and civic engagement, and for people to engage in these questions in a different way and to have a better understanding. We need to do that also in order to get people to see that we need government action to fix a broken economy, right? Not just to fix broken people or to help a certain category of people who are already seen as trying to advance themselves to succeed in the current environment. So it's really about fixing broken systems and getting people to see themselves as citizens and having a role to play in all this. So that's why we thought this hash it out conversation was important. These are one of the topics that has emerged in our field work and our conversations with you as worth spending time in kind of conversation like this. So that's why we're doing this. That's just a bit of a setup from how we see this topic and why it's worth sort of grappling with. And I want to again thank our presenters who are joining us to talk about this. And we're going to go ahead and get started with the meat of today's conversation. And so I'm going to really turn it to Gavin in Ohio. And Gavin, I see you've unmuted yourself. And
Hi, everybody.
Welcome, Gavin. And Gavin is one of our partners who we've been in particular conversation around this exact topic just in recent months, and has really seen this present itself in their work in Ohio. And thank you, Gavin. And I'm just going to go ahead and let you take the floor and share how this challenge has presented itself in your work and the work of your allies, and how you guys are dealing with it and thinking about it. And I'm going to unvideo feed myself for just a little while we hear from you. And thank you again.
Great. Thanks, Elaine. Hi, everybody. I am Gavin DeVore-Leonard. I'm the state director of One Ohio Now. We're a budget and revenue coalition of 100 partner organizations, health and human service, labor advocacy groups, primarily doing work around tax policy in Ohio. And I think I'm the part of the presentation that is meant to talk about those sticky issues a little bit, and to hopefully make them connect a little bit to what you might feel or see in your state and in your experience. So I'm just going to talk for a couple minutes about what we've seen here in Ohio and how that plays out in a very sort of personal, direct way. We do a lot of lobbying, testimony with legislators, one-on-one conversations, as well as public education work, talking with our partners, members, that kind of thing. And a lot of what we want to do, and a lot of those, perfect paragraphs and messaging that we get from public works and other organizations that Elaine mentioned, are sort of calling on us and asking us and pushing us to talk about how systems aren't working and how they can work better. And so we try to talk a lot about systems. In my work, I'm obviously talking a lot about the revenue system and how our tax policy system, is working or not. And what we find, though, is that very frequently we're trying to talk about systems, but we end up talking about individuals, about anecdotal stories, and then either very directly, specifically, or through framing the idea of personal responsibility. So this kind of concept, I think, has been really vexing and really challenging here in Ohio. I think especially since the debate and discussion about Medicaid expansion, which obviously happened in 2013. I'm sure some of you are from states where this is, Medicaid expansion has happened. Other places it's still a fight. Other places it didn't happen. And because of that conversation around Medicaid expansion, and then because of our Governor John Kasich, and the way he has talked about poverty, we've been sort of in this space where this personal responsibility issue has come up really consistently. So I'm just going to go through some specific examples that we've been hearing that sort of evoke this framing, and then just kind of kick it back over to everybody else to discuss. So the first example, the way the governor talks about this pretty much all the time is he uses this language of living in the shadows. He talks about people in poverty and how there are people living in the shadows, and the way he talks about it is sort of immediately this otherizing that takes place that it's sort of a challenging place to begin the discussion from. Then we see that discussion of other people come up in a lot of different ways. Just after the election here in November, there's a conference that takes place. It's called Impact Ohio. It's sort of this policy-based conference where the number 2 Republican in the House, longtime state legislator named Ron Amstutz, was talking about some of these issues and used the term uneducated barbarians to talk about people that were on poverty that needed sort of a push to get. Then he talked about people getting out of their parents' basements, and he had this whole sort of language and discourse he used. And these are the kinds of sort of terms and framing that we hear from folks pretty frequently. While Representative Amstutz actually backed off of that statement relatively quickly when pushed on it, we heard that sort of same basic story and that framing repeated multiple times in a way that makes us wonder and think that it really seems like it's coordinated. There's also, I think, the barbarian term in particular, was a sort of signifier to us of what we've heard and seen from many folks, particularly around this question of how the personal responsibility and self-sufficiency framing is sort of the newest iteration of some of the coded racial messaging that we've seen over time. Ian Haney Lopez, in his book Dog Whistle Politics, I think really makes this argument that this push for personal responsibility and self-sufficiency is sort of the new way to talk about welfare queens without being immediately targeted as being racist. And yet it's really evoking some of the same ideas in the public consciousness. So that's some of the couple of the examples that we hear in the sort of the way these terms get brought up. And then actually most recently here, there are about 150,000 people that have already been kicked off of Medicaid this year because of some real systems that I think are really fundamentally broken, where people are being asked to fill out a 12-page form that then it's not clear where you send it to, and it's not getting to a lot of people. And we have some real broken systems, and yet the thing we hear from legislators, and then what we hear from the administration in this case, is literally using the language, there is personal responsibility, in response to, why isn't this working? I say, well, it's a personal responsibility issue. And I think that relates to what I've heard a lot in my one-on-one conversations with legislators. In particular, a conversation comes to mind, that I shared with some folks from Public Works. Was talking with a representative here in Ohio, I think reasonable guy who's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, so leads a lot of discussion on tax policy. Republican from a rural part of Ohio, who, when talking about the sort of systems of our total tax policy, our revenue system, generally seem to kind of get the concerns around regressivity, but on the income tax, and particularly the question of people having, quote, skin in the game, really kept coming back to this argument around personal responsibility and how people needed to do their part. And what we find is that even if people understand that the total system is regressive, that the sales tax is regressive, that when we try to have a conversation about the total system, that people really just sort of err back to talking about, and particularly Republicans err back to the, this discussion about individuals and individual responsibility. And so I think our process has been really trying to figure out, how do we pivot from that? How do we shift the conversation away from that framing? And that's what led me here. In talking with the folks from Public Works about this, it seemed like a challenge that hasn't been, there aren't clear answers, at least that I've been able to find. I've looked at stuff from a lot of different entities that have done work on this. And so this was, I think, an opportunity to be part of a dialogue, to hear what other people around the country are doing, and to bring some resources to light, and then to start trying to work on this issue together. So yeah, it's a little about what's going on in Ohio and how this question is a very real challenge to moving good policy and good messaging conversations here on the ground. So I'm going to pass it back over here, but look forward to the conversation, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Gavin. Really terrific examples of how we realize how this presents sort of interesting and unique, very difficult challenge about how to get people pivoting back to thinking of these things as systemic challenges and bigger challenges, and getting people to see a sense of interdependence and interconnectedness when it's the default, just because of the way humans think and the way things are being sort of framed in the dominant public discourse around a narrative around individuals and personal responsibility. So thank you so much for sharing how this experience is playing out in Ohio. And we certainly welcome also, as we proceed in the conversation, welcome your wisdom and your thoughts on things that you've tried and what you do think that is working or not working. And so similarly, we want to now hear from Tazra in North Carolina, because there are also some interesting ways in which this challenge and topic has presented itself to not Tazra and her allies there in North Carolina, working both not only to raise awareness about poverty, and poverty is a systemic challenge that needs public solutions, but also on sort of the need for resources in the state budget to invest in programs that serve families and communities. So I'll turn the conversation over to Tazra for a few minutes here. Tazra? Tazra was just here a second ago. I'm quite sure other people saw her video as well.
Yes. Sorry, I think I got disconnected. There we go.
Hi, Tazra. Well, I should let you know that at least from my end, it looks like I can only hear you. Presumably, maybe your video feed will come in shortly. Oh, there, it's back. All right, well, welcome, Tazra. If you're ready, we'll go ahead and let you share some of your observations on this topic from North Carolina. Go ahead, Tazra.
Okay. Thank you for your patience. I apologize for that. So thank you for the introduction. I work at the Budget and Tax Center, which is a project of the North Carolina Justice Center in North Carolina. And today, at our core, we're an anti-poverty organization. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about how to talk about anti-poverty programs that are so important to the people that we work on behalf of every day without triggering that independence and self-sufficiency frame. Often when we talk about
it looks like Tazra is cutting out again. Give her a second to see if she can plug back in. I don't know, perhaps one of my colleagues could send Tazra a quick text or email in case she's somewhere out there still talking and we're not hearing her. Certainly hope that's not the case. Still waiting on Tazra.
I know.
Oh, Tazra, I just heard your audio again. If you want to, Tazra, you might.
I think I keep getting disconnected.
I wonder if you want to just try and not load your video and just keep your audio going. Maybe trying to do both of those things is presenting too much of a challenge for your system or your connection. Although now all of a sudden you're coming in very clearly. Let's try again. One more time.
I'll do that. Okay, well, I'm so sorry, everybody.
That's fine. Thanks, Tazra.
Okay, so I'll just go ahead and jump right into it. I work at an anti-poverty organization, and we often talk about all of these programs that really fight poverty and reduce poverty. But oftentimes, when we talk about them, we can trigger that self-sufficiency frame that Elaine gave such a great overview about. When we trigger that powerful myth that has really persisted for throughout American political culture, we do all our work sort of a disservice. And even if we don't mean to do that, we trigger these frames that that each of us can make it entirely on our own if we only make good choices, if we work hard enough, if we study and we get a good education. But if you look at the data, time and time again proves that that's just not the case. For many advocates, helping families achieve self-sufficiency and economic security has in many instances become a default way of thinking as the national economy remains off kilter. Poverty is stuck high, middle household incomes are stagnant, and income inequality is growing really fast. But again, if we're not careful, how we talk about these anti-poverty programs can confirm those pre-existing beliefs about broad public support for autonomy. And that's really not ideal, because evoking this language of foundational myths can in the end be used to make the case for curtailing these supports that people who are low income really desperately need. And we're seeing that today play out. The House and Senate and Congress just passed budgets that drastically cut aid to people who are low income and who live in poverty. So how we talk about this really does have an impact on people's lives. One dominant cultural narrative to be aware of that we can inadvertently queue up is that deserving versus undeserving narrative that Elaine spoke about earlier. Of course, the undeserving narrative is that people are poor because of their own bad choices, or because they're lazy, or they have a drug addiction, and that the safety net only encourages dependency. Whereas the deserving frame are people who work but are still poor through no fault of their own, or people who can't take reasonable steps to avoid poverty, like people who are older adults and who can no longer work, or people who have a disability. In North Carolina, unfortunately, we saw this narrative play out in a speech that then Speaker of the House, Tom Tillis, gave in 2011. And right now we're going to see a 30-second clip of his remarks.
But what we have to do is find a way to divide and conquer the people who are on assistance. We have to show respect for that woman who has cerebral palsy and had no choice in her condition, that needs help, and that we should help. And we need to get those folks to look down at these people who choose to get into a condition that makes them dependent on the government and say, at some point, you're on your own. We may end up taking care.
Looks like it's loading, Tazra. I think Anika is handling that on our end, but we'll just give it another minute.
Care of those babies, but we're not going to take care of. But what we have to do is find a way to divide and conquer the people who are on assistance. We have to show respect for that woman who has cerebral palsy and had no choice in her condition, that needs help and that we should help. And we need to get those folks to look down at these people.
Well, of course, it loaded beautifully in our test run yesterday, but
that makes them
now it seems
dependent
like we're
on the
having some
government
problems.
and say, at some point, you're on your own.
Anika, let me know at what point, if you think that this might not happen, that we should move on.
Elaine, this is Anika. People are telling me they were able to see the video, so it was played.
Well, it's just me then, which is perfectly fine because I've seen it already. So go ahead.
It's been played.
Great. I've seen it, so that's no problem. Tazra, why don't you go ahead and take it back up with your rest of your thoughts. Tazra, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm just going to keep my video off.
All right. Well, go ahead and go ahead and proceed with your remarks whenever you're ready.
Okay. So I don't know if you all got a chance to see the video, but basically we had a then Speaker of the House talk about this deserving versus undeserving poor narrative. And I'll just briefly read the first couple of sentences. He went on to say that what we have to do is find a way to divide and conquer the people who are on assistance. We have to share respect for that woman who has cerebral palsy and who had no choice in her condition, that needs help and that we should help. And we need to get those folks to look down at these people who choose to get into a condition that makes them dependent on the government and say, at some point, you're on your own. So what you'll see is that we have public policymakers, elected officials who are open about who openly talk about this deserving and undeserving poor narrative. But sometimes they'll go beyond that rugged individualism and actually recommend a divide and conquer approach to work and income supports. And really that's unacceptable. And I think a lot of people agree that, but oftentimes as advocates, even if we don't use that language that is as shameful and direct as the quote that I just read you, sometimes we can nonetheless tap into that independent self-sufficiency frame. And you know, when I was preparing for my remarks, the earned income tax credit, which is something that I work on a lot at the Justice Center, sort of popped in my head. I think that as advocates, we've been really successful at carving out groups from the undeserving poor category, such as the earned income tax credit. But in some cases, it's really made it harder to advocate for other groups, such as for people who have disabilities. It's really expedient to talk about the earned income tax credit because it implies people are working. They're out there trying to provide for their families. But in a way, it serves as a counter to that autonomy myth. But it also allows the other side to frame the debate in a way. You know, among progressives, we often say no one who works deserves to be poor. But, you know, as I thought about it more, you know, it really ought to be no one deserves to be poor, period. And to add to that, just because you have a job doesn't mean that you're financially secure. There's a big difference between self-sufficiency and working or being off of public assistance. You know, Elaine touched on this earlier. The superior way to lift up these issues and talk about anti-poverty programs is that interdependence frame, how poverty in any community impacts us all rather than that independence individual frame. We really ought to tap into that collective barn raising attitude and make the point that we are all in this together. Otherwise, our default way of thinking about work and income supports in today's economy can end up undermining our long-term goals of seeking, especially to move beyond linking welfare to work. I'm glad that we're going to hash this out today, because one area that we need to do more work on is we haven't really figured out how to best talk about extreme poverty, people who face the most extreme need and material deprivation. When it comes to anti-poverty programs, society is very focused on work first, but we really need to move beyond that frame, because it just isn't realistic for everybody. There's always going to be people who will, never be able to work, either due to a disability, old age, and who their bodies just can't handle work anymore, or for folks who have a mental illness. Figuring out the message is really important, especially because policy in the end is impacted. Supports for people living in extreme poverty, for those who need it the most, have been declining over the last several decades, while the aid has been targeted to more low and moderate income folks. And I think that that's a result of the way that we frame these programs on both sides. And lastly, the point that I want to raise up is, Elaine also touched on this, is that there's a short window of opportunity to get this right. As the economy gradually improves, if history is any indication, empathy for folks who are low income and who are poor is going to diminish, or at least likely to diminish. It's sort of ebbed and flowed with the economy over time. And as the need for, but the need for anti-poverty programs will always exist. So we sort of have to get this right before the economy fully recovers and before public support diminishes. And again, I think that, the best way to move forward is to, know what triggers this independence and self-sufficiency frame, and try to pivot to that interdependence frame and lift up how poverty in any community impacts us all. And again, that's the end of my remarks. And again, I apologize for those technical difficulties.
Thank you, Tazra. That was really helpful. I want to just lift out just a few things that jumped out to me from the comments from Gavin and Tazra. I mean, first, I definitely want to thank Gavin as well for calling out the fact that you really cannot separate out this conversation about self-sufficiency and people's dominant images about government, the appropriate role for government in the economy and for helping individuals and communities, and this question about race and to what extent people map in their minds to racialize who's on public assistance or public services and who's paying for them and who's not. And they're really inextricably linked. And it is important that we kind of deal with both of them at the same time, because they're both clearly feeding into and playing out in this important way. And and Tazra, it sounded like your technology worked great. If anything, it was only on my end. Everybody else, most people, it sounds like we're able to see the video. When we send out the resources afterwards, if there were other people like me for whom the video just didn't load fast enough to see, we'll make sure we send out a link to that so you can take a look at it, since you, that sounds like a couple other people maybe missed that clip, but most people, it seems like, got to see it. I want to call out also what Tazra said about interdependence, and sometimes it seems like it's also important. It's important for us to have as part of this public debate, reminding people of the specific roles that these people, that the people that we're talking about are our neighbors, are our friends, and they are playing vital roles in our communities. They might be caring for children at preschool, or keeping the food system safe. They are caring for our older adults, certainly in many instances, and they might be in poverty or poverty level wages. And I, also highlighting something that came out from Tazra's comments to me, is this idea that the reality is we can't afford to create sort of this image of this one hypothetically sort of very perfect and very deserving individual, because we know that the reality is that different individuals, and particularly different communities, face very different barriers and challenges to succeeding in the economy. And it's just important not to set up hurdles for, as Tazra said, describing the role that government, public assistance, and public services need to play in some communities, and people, certain individuals facing certain challenges versus others. So those were really terrific. I wonder, we had a really interesting question posed by Francis, who I believe is in Texas with the Center for Public Policy Priorities. And I'm wondering if we could, Public Works team, manage to unmute Francis, or unmute and maybe even see her video feed if she's up for that. Frances, so that she can really kind of deliver this question in person, because it's one worth giving voice to if we can.
Okay, Frances, we have unmuted you, and we've also made your video available, so if you want to come on screen, you're welcome to do so. And Elaine, we have another question after Frances.
Okay, great. And Frances would also need to unmute herself on her end as well. It's not just enough for us to unmute you, Frances. You also need to unmute yourself. Are you there? Okay, well, Frances can chime in whenever she's ready. Why don't we move on to the next question and give Frances a second to figure out her technology on her end. What is our other question? I don't...
Sure, it is Joanne Schwartz, and Joanne, let me unmute you and promote you to video if you'd like to join us via video, and you can ask us your question.
Joanne, are you there? Oh, why don't I just read Joanne's question for now, and if Joanne and or Frances want to plug into the conversation in a minute, they're fine. So Joanne says, well, she started by saying it's also beautiful in Kentucky today. Glad to hear that. She says there was a time when most communities had people of different economic groups. In this way, there was much more interaction and understanding of circumstances in life. And people more and more segregate by income. And so there's a great disconnect and misunderstanding, and how to educate people about this. I think that's a really terrific question. I certainly think there were civic spaces and community spaces and ways in which people interacted. And you're right, whether it's communities of faith and where people worship or where they work, and exactly in terms of communities and where they live, has created this whole other set of challenges that I think we have to grapple with, which is the fact that we have, and I agree with you very much, Joanne, an erosion in the spaces in which people would have interacted with people in very different economic circumstances than themselves. And I think that's, that's not something very specific that Public Works directly obviously works on that. We do work with people who are thinking about more community level spaces and conversations and ways to create community level conversations and engagements. And we can put you in touch with some of that. I don't know if maybe Anika wanted to offer a comment on that. Groups like Everyday Democracy and others who are really thinking about more about this, how are we going to create conversations and spaces in communities to sort of build this understanding again. Not that it was ever perfect, but we certainly did have places in almost a front porch effect in America that presented a set of interactions that has been certainly eroding over time. So I certainly agree with you on that. And I don't know if any of the other speakers, if Julie or Anika or anybody else wants to offer a comment on that, feel free to weigh in. I think it's a very important observation.
Joanne notes that there is more mixed housing coming to cities.
Yes, I mean, I certainly think, and folks, maybe there's somebody on the call who, or in the conversation, who works more around issues of affordable housing, but there certainly has been certainly great advancements in that field of sort of housing and sort of planning communities to go in this direction of sort of, not only mixed use, but mixed income level housing. And there's certainly great examples of communities going in that direction in recent years. And hopefully that will get a little bit at this question that Joanne raised, because I certainly agree with that.
And Frances, we may have just unmuted your phone. We found your phone number, so can you talk and see if we can hear you?
Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Woohoo! Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Thanks for taking my question. So we have been doing very similar to the to EPI and the Wider Opportunities for Women and many other organizations that have produced kind of family budgets work. We've been doing that since 2001. Originally, it was, as many of the other organizations have done as well, it was in response to the inadequacy of the poverty measure.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, the supplemental poverty measure, although it has been kind of discussed and researched for a decade prior to when we started, it really wasn't, well accepted. Over time, we have really taken our family budgets work in our kind of online interactive tool as a way to be able to help people understand what does it actually take to be able to cover basic needs. And then when people aren't able to make that amount in a job, so then it leads to that whole conversation that we've been talking about this morning, right, about people who are working. We're really focusing on working people, right? And what kinds of jobs they can get and the education that it takes to get you to that kind of job. And then we also take people when we're presenting this information down the road about, okay, when people cannot make those budgets, what do we have to do as a society to help make sure that the basic needs are still met? Childcare, food, safe housing, and that kind of thing. But it's pretty laborious. I mean, it takes doing a presentation and leading people along the way to get them there. So part of that is figuring out how to be really creative in the kind of online presentation, but another is about the messaging use of family budgets itself. So I guess my point is we're not using it so much to talk about the inadequacies of poverty anymore, but more to talk about the system of interconnected resources and tools that make for a vibrant community and to how to support people to have healthy, safe lives. But it takes a lot of words, clearly, because I've said lots of words.
Well, it sounds like you're already heading in a great direction that we could probably learn from looking at what you've been putting out there on there. I know that Tazra and her organization is the organization in North Carolina that does that really spearheads the similar work here. So she might have to have an observation, but it certainly seems like clearly I would endorse the direction that you've already said that you've headed with this, and we would be happy to help you think through, are there shorter, more expedient ways to get to the same point? We'd be happy to look at that.
I'd love that.
That's an ongoing challenge, and we struggle with it. We struggle with it, but we work on it with people all the time, which is to say, here's a narrative or a set of points we feel like we need to get across, and we want to get them across in far fewer words, or perhaps just even using images, and we'd be happy to help with that. I mean, I will say, using your tool as a way to tell a story about sort of a broken economy, and an economy in which we not only need to sort of fundamentally change that system, but then we also need public systems in place that sort of address that system and fill in the gaps and make it work for everyone. Like I said, it sounds like you're already taking that. I mean, another thing would be, we've already talked about the importance of helping people to see, well, here are the important roles that these people that we're talking about in this report are playing in our communities, and why, to Tazra's point, why it's important that we have all of these people. We need all of these people to succeed so they can continue to play these vital and important roles that are connected, that we then can see as connected to ourselves and to the future success of the community as a whole. And then also thinking about community level spokespeople and messengers for it, and not just the people themselves that we see in these categories of these budgets. So whether that's the community college president or that's the small business manager, but thinking about the spokespeople for it too is so important in these conversations. So I thank you, Frances. We would be glad to sit down with you and do some more work on that. It's a great point, and it sounds like you're already heading in a great direction, and we could all benefit from seeing what you're pulling together. I will say that in the interest of time, we really need to move on to hearing from Julie Rowe from the Opportunity Agenda. I could tell you a lot about Julie and the Opportunity Agenda, but that would use up the valuable time, and you will be able to see for yourself once she presents this information and her thoughts on this topic, what an important voice and set of information they have to inform this conversation that we're having. So thank you, Julie. I will let you take it from here.
Great, thank you. So I hope everyone can hear me and you can see the slide. I'll keep an eye on the group chat in case there are problems. But so basically, a lot of this goes to some of the ways that stories are told in our country, and the way that kind of the human brain works, and also the way that our audiences are hearing these things. And so one of the things that we've recently been working on is we did a survey called the Opportunity Survey that took a look at some of the kind of underlying values that really inform the way people think about issues, particularly social justice issues, and specifically around poverty and racial justice and criminal justice and a few other things. And unsurprisingly, we found that the U.S. public is of two minds. I mean, they're clearly of more than that. There's millions, but two kind of very specific ways of falling down on particularly social justice issues. And one is, of course, that idea of individual responsibility, dependency, division, and kind of doing things the way they've been done, or relying a lot on tradition and kind of older ways of thinking. And then there are folks who are open to the idea that we have a linked fate, that opportunity is one of our core values and should be available to everybody. The idea of the common good, and the idea that we should try new things and be open to new ideas. And, you know, these fall on extremes, but most people overlap and have both of these going on at the same time. We know that people can have two contradictory ideas happening. So what we've found is the most important in communicating is to trigger the one that we want, which is, of course, the second, the linked fate, opportunity, common good, innovation. And there's a number of different ways we can do that. You know, there's a number of different theories about why this is. Historically, a lot of our stories and history are really based in the individual responsibility frame, the idea of the rugged individual, the bootstrap stories, all of these things, and that, you know, if you work hard enough, you can become anything in this country. And that's a very attractive story for a lot of people for a number of different reasons. But George Lakoff in particular has given some thought in his book Moral Politics, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, about this idea of why people kind of fall down on either side. And, you know, one of them is that people who are kind of thinking about individual responsibility and rugged individualism are not necessarily mean-spirited people who don't care about individuals, but rather are thinking more in terms of what George Lakoff calls a strict father framing, which is this idea that the world is essentially a dangerous place. And if you're taking care of people, you're setting them up to protect themselves, to be self-sufficient, to have self-discipline. And that if you don't do that, you're letting them down. So you're fostering dependency is actually hurting people. And in this kind of mindset is also the idea that, you know, competition is a more important value than cooperation, and that inequality is actually a natural state, and that success flows from self-discipline. So fostering self-discipline is the most important thing that you can do as a parent. He uses a parenting metaphor, but also then as a government. So he opposes that to this nurturant parent idea, which is that humans are essentially good, and nurturing others and ourselves is a goal and a moral value, and that we should try to foster cooperation and community over competition. And also the inequality is not a natural state, but actually reflects unequal opportunity and systemic and structural barriers. So you can see how these two kinds of ideas can be at odds with each other, but also people can have both of them at the same time. For instance, as a parent, I would like my kids to be cooperative and help others, but I also want them to, you know, do their homework without me nagging at them all the time, right? There are these kind of, you can have both ideas. So it's really, what do we trigger when we talk to people? And this graph kind of shows how over time, these two ideas have gone back and forth. So this question asks, in your opinion, which is generally more often to blame if a person is poor, is that a lack of effort on his or her own part, or circumstances beyond his or her own control? And so this shows how that those two kind of conflicting ideas can go back and forth depending on what the media conversation is, depending on what's happening with the economy, depending on what's happening most recently in other kinds of areas in the news and in the world. People can either see beyond and see why circumstances can cause a person to experience poverty, or they can be much more on the side of the kind of, it's up to your own, how much effort you put into making money and that sort of thing. So the good news is this toggles back and forth, and it really, it is not set. People are not set specifically in the individual mindset and set in the blaming mindset. They can be changed. And so that's an important thing for us to remember, and also to pay attention to the conversations and the media conversations and what's going on, the rhetoric, so that we can key into that and know kind of where people are at any given point, so that we know what we're working with. Because as we all know, as communicators, any of us who are messaging ever, we're not working with blank slates. People have a lot of things going on in their head, and it's really up to us to figure out, you know, how to talk to them in a way that brings up these better ideas. So I just want to give one example of that, one example of the way that we sometimes can inadvertently bring up the wrong kind of frame. So for instance, in our metaphors, one of the metaphors that I think we like to use a lot is level the playing field, which talks about basically that we're all in competition with one another, but that they're unfair. The playing field is not level, so we can't all play against each other and one team's always going to win. But obviously that means that if we're talking about, leveling the playing field in education or in, work opportunities or whatever, that someone's still going to lose, right? There's still a winner and a loser. And so we need to watch the metaphors and the way that we talk about things. One of the ways that I've heard this idea described before, the interdependent idea described in a metaphor is, for instance, there's a parking lot that is super dark at night. There's no lights, and it becomes quite a hazard. People are running into each other, they're stumbling over objects, they're losing their way. So one of the ways to address that is through that kind of go it alone mentality that we saw, the on your own kind of mindset that we saw the legislator using in the video, right? Which would mean everyone has to go out and get their own headlamp. Right? Everyone's responsible for getting their own headlamp so that they can make their way through the parking lot. Well, clearly we know that's ridiculous. That's not the way we solve problems in this country. We look around and we say, hey, can we pool our resources and get some lights to illuminate this whole thing so that we're all safer, right? So there's ways to kind of think about how we can tell these stories and to really illuminate how ridiculous it can look if we're really trying to say you're on your own, go it alone, that we don't need each other. So because we're running a little late, I'm going to just stop there and see. Oh, and I also just want to note, though, on the race question, which is really important, and I'm not sure we're going to have time to talk too much about, in the resources, I have provided Public Works with some work that Drew Weston has done about unconscious prejudice, is what he calls it. We've also called it implicit bias, but just some ideas about how to talk to people about what that means and how it exists in our society, and to try to get the conversation going about that. All right, I'm going to pause now.
Too, if you don't mind. It was really terrific, and I certainly don't want to cut you short at all, Julie, because that was so important. And I want to say that we intentionally structured this particular conversation less as a presentation of very specific recommendations. Here's what you should say. Here's what you should do, which I think was great because, as we said, there were a lot of reasons to have this be more of a hash it out. But I will say we also recognize that we have those of you, who are here that are interested in the conversation and interested in, hey, so what are you saying? What are the recommendations? What should I be doing? And we've got, in particular, a question that's just come through, just like that, from Julie Latimer. It says, given our well-documented realities, which is mostly what we've all been talking about, right? With the exception of Julie, who started working more into recommendations, what can and should we do strategically to begin to sort of change this common narrative? So I guess I want to start, I think that's a great place to begin our wrap up. And I would say Julie has already said we're going to send out resources. She has given us some great resources, which we will pass along. We will also work on a summary of all of this and include some sort of observations and recommendations from Public Works. So we're not just going to open up this challenging, sticky conversation and leave you without recommendations. But like I said, we had reasons for wanting to set it up more as a conversation. But specifically to this question that Julie just posed, which is to say, hey, given these well-documented realities and this that we've all just been talking about, what can and should we do strategically to change the common narrative? So Julie, do you want to just offer some, if we're talking not about going in the direction of a personal responsibility frame and needing to pivot away from that to something else, do you want to summarize again for us kind of what you see from the research you've done and the other research that you've been talking about, what you see as the alternative frame or frames that we should be trying to uplift and lead with in our own communications?
Sure. So, and Tazra already certainly touched on this, the idea of interdependence and interconnectedness, and how we can, at any given point, make that case first before we get into talking about individuals at all. Another thing is that when we talk to the media, often we're asked for individual stories, but we know that if we only put together individual stories, what we're going to inadvertently tell our audiences is that either look at this great story and this great person and they're going to think, why can't everybody just be like that? or we're going to say, look at this person who we need to individually fix, and they're going to think, yeah, just fix that one bad thing and then everything will be fine. So if we can really find ways to tell individual stories that have embedded in them a systemic solution. So for instance, somebody who maybe worked within a system and figured out that it was a problematic system, they can speak to how the system affected many different people. So they have a compelling individual story, but they embedded in it is the idea that the system needs to change and that we all have a responsibility to that, not just holding up this one great person. So there are ways we can think about being strategic. Another way is to think about how we also even attack our opposition, if you want to call it that. If we're going to talk about how we're all in it together and interdependent, we need to be careful about not saying, so we all are deserving of this consideration, except for those people who I don't agree with or I don't like, right? So one of the things that we recommend is to actually think about critiquing the mindset or the, as I was saying before, that's just another example of that go it alone mentality that hasn't, that got us into trouble before in economic times and hasn't moved us forward together. We found that when we have moved forward is when we've come together and put together, our great minds and American innovation spirit and all those kinds of things and actually fix things together.
Yes, thank you. I said we certainly would echo and reinforce those recommendations from Public Works, and we have spent a lot of time working with people on how to do individual stories that are designed with the intent of telling systemic stories, to your point, and certainly also this notion that you just brought up about the need to critique a mentality or even an ideology, right, and not so much the individuals who are sort of behind it or giving voice to it is also so important, because ultimately that's our greater challenge. The individuals who are sort of espousing it will come and go, but it's the ideology that we need to unpack and get underneath and get beyond and help people to see how a different approach is actually the one that not only, to your point, very insightfully, Julie, not only it has been those times in our history where we have used public policy as a tool to advance sort of opportunity for everyone and advance the common good. And being able to point to some of those specific examples is also a very helpful communications tool for getting people to get in the mindset or the mentality of seeing the important role for public systems and public policy. It's a very helpful, and we know from our research and from yours, very helpful communications tool. So I hope, Julie, that last wrap up there got you generally in the direction that you were more interested in, right? Which was thinking about specific recommendations on reframing. And as I said, we, number one, we are going to send out a set of resources and tools. We'll send out the resources that Julie mentioned, as well as a summary, as well as a recording of this, and some other resources and recommendations from Public Works. We also wanted to mention today that we are launching a new space for us to all do more of this kind of thing. That is posing these challenging questions to each other, sharing great examples with one another about this, and really being a resource to one another. Like I said in the beginning, there is so much wisdom in this room, and I'm going to use the room metaphor since we were trying to have a conversation, even though, as you can see, we're still working out this whole Fuse platform. But so we're launching a new tool that is really kind of exclusive. It is for Public Works and its partners, people around the country that we've been working so closely with over the years, to be a place where we share resources, you do, and where we hash out some of these sticky questions. And because, like I said, and like Julie said, we know these are difficult to grapple with, and certainly difficult then to sort of operationalize on the ground in your own organizations and your campaigns and your communities. So we will, as we send in the follow-up to this, send resources and a link to this. And I see that my colleague Anika has popped up her video feed, which I think is her very not so subtle way of saying that she has something she'd like to add here as we conclude. So what did you have to add, Anika?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Elaine, for all of that. I just wanted to make sure that I brought up a comment from Margie from the Topos Partnership, who has been great colleagues of ours for quite some time now. And I just want to read it out loud. We need to keep focus on community and economic impact, talk about jobs, not people in jobs, use new faces, the employer who supports policy change, the mayor who sees community benefit in programs. And I know that they have also a lot of open source resources and we'll make sure to put that on the follow-up as well. So I just wanted to make sure we read that.
Yes, thank you for that. We certainly echo those recommendations, and hopefully those also came clear throughout the conversation. And yeah, Topos has some fantastic resources on a wide range of topics, but particularly the work they've been doing on quality jobs and how to articulate the case for better wages, and giving people new ways of thinking about how the economy actually works is really fantastic. So thank you for that, Margie. So with that, I see that we are now a couple minutes past the hour that we intended, and boy, it went so very, very quickly. I hope that this was helpful to you all. Again, I know we went with a discussion-based approach rather than slides giving you specific language, but we thought this was an important topic to hash it out, so to speak, hence the name of this conversation. We're going to host some more conversations. Lastly, you'll be getting a very quick one-question survey after this that says, hey, what other challenging topics would you like for us to host a conversation like this in which we hash it out? There are a number of others that sort of bubble up from you in the field to us of, hey, this one's particularly tricky. Can we talk about this some more? And we want to create this space again to have those conversations around those topics as well. So we've pulled together what some of those that we think might be worth having, and we also have space for you to suggest some other ones as well. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We'll send you some follow-up resources, and a very, very big thank you to our guest presenters, Gavin and Tazra and Julie. I can't say enough about the work that you all are doing in helping us work through these questions, and what a valuable resource Gavin and Tazra you are as a model for people doing work in states, and then Julie as such a leader and thinker and helping people to see about how to really create this new narrative and public discourse around these questions that really can not only help people succeed in the short term as they build support for the campaigns and the public investments in making the case for today, but really how we can get underneath and create a